Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. So begins Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, the haunting story of a young woman possessed by jealous love. And life is pretty bleak for our unnamed narrator, our heroine, at the opening of the novel. We find her working as a paid companion for a thoroughly unpleasant older woman in Monte Carlo. But life brightens up for her when she meets the handsome yet mysterious widower Maxim de Winter. And when this older gentleman, who is thoroughly haunted and tortured by a tragic past, proposes and whisks her away to the famed Manderley, his isolated Cornish estate, our heroine thinks that life is about to get a lot more exciting and romantic, until she discovers that the memory of his beautiful and apparently perfect first wife, Rebecca, seems to haunt every corner of the halls of Manderley, and she discovers that she knows almost nothing about who her new husband really is. And not only that, who is she? And how is she supposed to compete with the dearly departed? And that is all I'm going to say about the plot for this incredible story. This bare bones synopsis gives you just as much as what you will find on the back cover of your edition of Rebecca, but I'm saying no more than that for the rest of the book, and we are keeping this discussion spoiler free. This discussion is designed to elevate your appreciation of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca going into the novel for the very first time. I also hope to provide some very rich textual and contextualizing information for rereaders, for readers who are returning to du Maurier's dark Gothic masterpiece for another read-through. But rest assured, I will be staying away from anything that spoils the plot, and I'll be asking rereaders who know the story to be conscious of preserving the secrets in the comments. Let's try and preserve the thrill of reading Rebecca for first-time readers. And we're talking about Rebecca today because, at time of recording, we are just now kicking off a brand new and exclusive lecture series and read-throughs for this incredible work at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We are reading Daphne du Maurier as the dark, moody, misty autumnal season descends upon us, and we're going to explore exactly why this story continues to haunt us today. My contention is that Rebecca is incredibly popular because Daphne du Maurier was writing very truthfully from her own pain, her own trauma, and her own feelings of possessive jealousy. And in so doing, she spoke to something universal in all of us. So join us at the Hardcore Literature Book Club for this incredible read-through, and let's begin today by meeting the author herself. Let's meet Daphne du Maurier, and let's walk through the halls of the real-life Manderley. One thing that I believe is very, very key when it comes to elevating your appreciation of literature is to understand these works of art as an extension of or product of another human being's soul. This book is a part of the writer herself. It is an extension of the individual's soul, her mind, and her culture and era. She channeled the concerns of her age, and in so doing spoke beyond her age. Now, here's a caveat. We must be very careful when it comes to biographical readings of our favourite writers and of literature in general, because biographical readings often say a lot more about the one doing the reading than the one being read. But when it comes to Dame Daphne du Maurier, we actually have an enormous amount of self-reflection and meditation upon her works in her own words. Now, she was very shy and reluctant to be in the limelight, but we are lucky, we are fortunate enough to have interviews with her. We have documentaries, we have correspondence and journal entries, and indeed, even if we did not, I think it's clear that her books breathe the very essence of who she was, and often our souls find themselves pulled like homing pigeons into specific locales. For example, the landscape and history of southwest England gave rise to Thomas Hardy's Wessex. The Yorkshire moors would provide the fertile environment needed for the novels and poetry of the Bronte sisters. And if we're thinking about urban locales, what would the novels of Charles Dickens be without London? We cannot even envision what they might be without these locations. And for Daphne du Maurier, the locale that had her heart was Cornwall. And in the heart of Cornwall, she found herself captivated by a grand romantic estate called Menabilly. One can hardly say the name Daphne du Maurier without mentioning Cornwall, and indeed for many readers who fall in love with her novels, Cornwall becomes like a mecca. They travel there, they visit there regularly to find the locales that are described so beautifully and so sublimely on the page. Now the thing is, Daphne actually would not come to Cornwall until she was 19 years old. She was actually born in London. She was the daughter of two famous actors. Her father was a very famous man. He was an actor and stage manager called Gerald du Maurier, and he himself was the son of the famous Victorian novelist and hypnotist George du Maurier, the author of the Gothic novel Trilby, and he was also the grandfather to the 5 boys who would inspire J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan stories. As you might expect, growing up in such a theatrical and literary family, Daphne and her 2 sisters were exposed from a very young age to a world of imagination, a world of rich storytelling and theatrics, a world of make-believe in which she could be anything she wanted to be. And from a very young age, it would seem that what Daphne wanted to be was a boy, and she would feel this burgeoning masculine energy, what she referred to as the hidden boy within her, the boy in the box. That was her male alter ego, who she called Eric Avon. And as a young girl, she would always assume the role of the leading male character in their childhood stories. They would recreate their favourite stories. A really popular one that they enjoyed was The Three Musketeers, and Daphne would always play D'Artagnan. Now sadly, later on in life, she would say that this was due to her father. Her father had wished that she had been a boy, and she was desperate to secure his approval. Now, further to this, Daphne saw firsthand her father's struggles with alcoholism and anger. She saw his blatant extramarital affairs, and she would also talk of him having a possessive jealousy over her, his daughter, and an overbearing intimacy that ultimately crossed the line into what many now see as abuse. And it would become clear that Daphne would be working through some serious trauma over the course of her life. Now, as her adolescence approached, her dislike for her sex intensified. She would speak of only wanting to have sons when she was older, but this also developed into romantic and sexual attraction for women. And from London, she was sent to a finishing school in Paris, where she fell under the spell of the head mistress. She felt what she called a fatal, bewitching attraction for this older woman who inspired Daphne to write stories. Now, Daphne was already primed to be a storyteller from a very young age. She just needed the encouragement, and in her teenage years she had absolutely inhaled the works of the Bronte sisters, and she was devouring French literature from the likes of Guy de Maupassant and Émile Zola. And we see, thanks to this headmistress, a profusion of short stories poured forth. And there was certainly something heady and intoxicating in the air when it came to the Paris of the 1920s. This was the café culture era, in which the young du Maurier would have been scribbling her stories in the very same cafes that the lost generation, the American writers like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein were writing and discussing. What a time to be a writer. Returning to London, Daphne's father would give voice to the homophobic prejudices of the day. These prejudices were a hangover from the Victorian era, and her father would hypocritically chastise Daphne and her sisters for their sexual liberality. But this wasn't the Victorian era anymore. Daphne was growing up and living in a time that was radically changing. The 1920s would reach their peak, with the right to vote being extended equally to both sexes in 1928. This was the very same year, by the way, that Virginia Woolf would publish Orlando, and we have a lecture series on that work, my favourite Virginia Woolf, at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. You read Orlando and you see the concerns of the era are very much there. You have a central protagonist who changes sex and sexuality as the centuries pass. By the time we get to the early 20th century, the Victorian anxiety of the new woman was being pushed back against, thanks really to the suffragette movement, who utilised social disruption to effect just and long-needed political reform. This wasn't the 19th century anymore, and we see that matters of sexuality and sexual independence was being explored much less covertly in fiction than it had been in the Victorian era. We see in the late Victorian Gothic works that homosexuality had to be kept in the shadows. We see that, for example, in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, it's always a good idea to get a quick orientation and a sense of our bearings when locating the historical epoch of the book we are reading, because we see time and again that each generation responds to or swerves from the generation that came before it. So Rebecca was published in 1938. The Victorian era was from 1837 all the way up to 1901, and my goodness, what a sweep of phenomenal works came during that period. Often the greatest works of Victorian literature are great because there was so much repression in that age. There were so many restraints, and so art is really fantastic when it's pushing up against the restraints, when it has something to say that maybe society's not going to like, and you're trying to thread that middle way and get away with it and explore it out in the open. And from 1901 to 1914, we had the Edwardian era, which I see as very much a transitional era. It feels like a transitional era from the Victorian period to the modern period. And we can see writers like Joseph Conrad, Thomas Hardy, and Henry James, and Rudyard Kipling, for example. They have their feet in both worlds. They are straddling a significant identity crisis as the world is rapidly becoming a very different place, technologically, culturally, politically, and yes, artistically. And then a shot rings out around the world in 1914 when the Archduke Ferdinand of Austro-Hungary is assassinated, and this lit the powder keg that was the First World War. Welcome to the modern world. I really do believe that modernism properly starts from 1914 onwards. The modern era is tragically defined by widespread machine warfare and senseless slaughter. It is a very nihilistic period in our history, and men and women marched into war with smiles on their faces. They called it the Great War, and they were pushed on by propaganda and pushed on with the belief that they would be back in Blighty by Christmas time. No one believed that the war would go on as long as it did, but as the war continued to roll on with very little sign of stopping, we see the collective morale takes a plunge, and we can actually chart the national mood in the UK, for example, by turning to the poetry of the time. If you look at the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon right at the beginning of the war, and then compare it with the poetry that they were writing as the war progressed, you see it is a very different vibe. You can see at the beginning of the war, people were naively optimistic, and you will find this overly romantic, saccharine sentimentality. But as the war progresses, the poetry becomes about as dark as it could possibly be. And this great sense of anger and existential despair just bursts at the poetic seams. Men came back from that war broken, if they were lucky to come back at all. And the world was now a very different place post-World War I. It was a more alien place, a more nihilistic place, a cold place, and existential despair descended upon the populace. This is something that had been looming and rising for a while. We've charted this a few times in our lectures at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We've seen how the Victorian era had a Schopenhauerian pessimism looming over it, and then that gradually builds and builds and builds, and all we need is the First World War in the 20th century before that's taken to fever pitch and we get a real existential crisis. And they say that the men who came back from the First World War never talked about it. They could not possibly talk about the hell they had just endured. Now, many channeled their trauma into great fiction. J.R.R. Tolkien, for example, he never spoke about his experience at the Battle of the Somme, but it's right there in his fantasy masterpiece, The Lord of the Rings. Now, Daphne was just a young girl during the First World War, but the man who would become her husband, Sir Frederick Browning, or indeed Major Browning, nicknamed Tommy, he was 10 years her senior, and he had fought in the First World War, and he had witnessed unspeakable things. He would become a famed officer of the Grenadier Guards and a very well-renowned, well-respected, high-ranking member of the British military. During the First World War, he had actually served for a time in the same battalion as Major Winston Churchill. But before Daphne met and fell in love with Tommy in a post-First World War world, before she met and fell in love with him, she had already fallen in love and already had her heart captured, not by a person, but by a sublime locale. She had fallen in love with Cornwall, and those who have had the experience personally can really attest to this. It absolutely is possible to fall in love with a location in a very similar way as to how you might fall in love with a person. So as I said, Daphne was 19 years old when she and her family visited Cornwall for the very first time. She was initially apprehensive. She didn't want to go. She was being transported from the metropolitan and cosmopolitan worlds of London and Paris, and she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure about going to this rural locale. But upon arrival at Ferryside, Bodinick, near Fowey in Cornwall, Daphne was immediately under the spell of the location, and it transformed her forever. She fell deep in love with the coast, the sea, the moor, the landscape, all of it. And she found herself discovering firsthand the sensations that she had only had when reading books. She loved the melancholy sound of the seashore. She loved how palpable the myths and legends were. It was really clear immediately why Cornwall had such a rich history of folklore. And Cornwall, even today, is very much a world entire unto itself, and it is far removed from London. It's far removed from the rest of the country and has a very strong, independent and unique identity. Cornwall's one of the Celtic nations that has its own language, a language that, thanks to enormous efforts over the last century or so, has been beautifully preserved and saved from extinction. One can see why Cornwall developed such a rich history. It's very much isolated. It's a peninsula isolated from the rest of England, and historically it was treated as a separate administrative area with its own parliament and a thoroughly thriving mining and fishing community. They mined tin and copper, and the myths and folklore of Cornwall is filled with the most extraordinary beings. You've got stories of these fairy-like beings known as piskies. The stories are filled with mermaids, and legends about giants abound. It's also said that Tintagel Castle in Cornwall was the birthplace of the mythic King Arthur. And so the Arthurian cycle of romances is woven right into the tapestry of the Cornish identity. Stories also abound, as you might expect, with really exciting incidents concerning smugglers and shipwrecks, the melodramatic romance of which resonated profoundly with Daphne. Now, walking along Pont Creek one afternoon, Daphne discovered the wreckage of a schooner, the Jane Slade, the wreckage of an old ship, and she became obsessed. Suddenly, her mind was alive. It was teeming with imaginative offerings so rich and exciting and romantic that she simply had to get them down on the page. And this directly inspired her to research the family history of the woman the wrecked ship was named after. And so this gave rise to her first novel, The Loving Spirit, in 1931, a book that takes its title from an Emily Bronte poem. On another evening, in her early 20s, Daphne set off on horseback, riding across Bodmin Moor, and she got lost in thick mist and found that she needed to take shelter at a coaching inn built in 1750 that had historically been a hangout for smugglers and was also filled with ghost stories. The inn was called Jamaica Inn, and you can still visit it today. Not only the real locale, but you can visit it in the fictional world too, because her stay at Jamaica Inn and the eerie atmosphere of it all would inspire Daphne to write her fourth novel and her first serious bestseller of the same title in 1936, Jamaica Inn, which is like a melodramatic fusion of Treasure Island and Wuthering Heights. And if you think that sounds exciting, then we share literary tastes, and it is exciting and it's worth reading. It is a thrilling tale of smugglers and dark love, set across the mysterious atmospheric landscape of Cornwall. And Jamaica Inn had been more successful than her three previous books combined, and it was thanks to this novel that she was signed on to a 3-book deal with the publisher Victor Galanx. But there was another building that captivated her and captured her imagination. Upon her first trip to Cornwall, whilst exploring the countryside, she discovered the hidden and partly decaying Georgian estate, this gorgeous mansion which had been boarded up and overgrown with weeds and ivy. And this estate was called Menabilly. From the moment Daphne saw it, she was in love. She was obsessed, and she dreamed of one day being able to restore it and inhabit its halls. Now, the love that Daphne had for Cornwall was clearly infectious, as Tommy, or Major Frederick Browning, who after the First World War had become an Olympic bobsleigh athlete, he read her first novel, The Loving Spirit, and he found that he simply had to go to Cornwall and breathe it all in. He had to experience the locale for himself. Well, not only that wasn't the only thing he wanted to find in Cornwall. He actually wanted to go and meet the author herself, the author of this intoxicating work. He was in love with her from her writing, and they met whilst he was sailing his boat across the creek one day, and they fell pretty instantaneously in love. Although when Tommy proposed to her Daphne rejected him. She said she did not believe in the institution of marriage, and we might say instead she didn't believe in the old, traditional, conventional ways of doing things, because just 3 months after their meeting, Daphne proposed to him, and he said yes. They were married very swiftly after, and they would end up having 3 children together, 2 girls and 1 boy. Though, unfortunately, their marriage would be very far from perfect. Daphne found herself developing a jealous streak. She was jealous over a woman from her husband's past, his ex-fiancée, Jan Ricardo, a woman that she saw as being very glamorous and beautiful and sophisticated, and she had a lot of insecurities about herself. She was quite shy, she was quite reserved, she seemed to be the polar opposite of this woman, and this jealousy that she was feeling only compounded when she discovered one day some old correspondence between her now husband and his ex-partner. And she said that these letters were of no import. There was nothing really significant in them. They were normal letters, innocent but preserved in time. But she could tell from the handwriting alone, which was drawn with a firm hand, that this woman was more confident and audacious than I. And her husband's ex-fiancée would sign her letters off with a very distinct flair, with a big R for Ricardo. This was a jealousy that Daphne, later on in life, would say was clearly rooted in and an extension of her somewhat incestuous feelings towards her father. She had a very complicated relationship with her father. Everything she has said about their relationship later in life leads us to believe that he was deeply abusive. But she was also absolutely crushed upon his death. Her father died just 2 years after she got married, and she was so crushed by it that she came to believe that he wasn't truly dead, or at least he wasn't truly gone. He hadn't departed, and his spirit, his soul, his ghost, we might say, was still with her. Now, she didn't go to the funeral, but instead she went up to Hampstead Heath and she released a load of birds. Birds were her father's favourite animal, and she adored birds too. She did that in memory of him, and she would speak of feeling his presence with her after his death. And it wasn't long after he died that she very swiftly lost herself in the writing of his biography. And the amount of great works that have bloomed directly or indirectly out of the death of a writer's father is almost the same number as there are works themselves. We've said many times over the course of our readings of the great books at the Hardcore Literature Book Club that when a creative, when an artist is confronted with trauma and confronted with death and grief, they very often channel that into something incredible, artistically speaking. Now, jealousy wasn't the only problem that Daphne and her husband had in their marriage. In a letter to her mother, Daphne would write of how thoroughly she was straining with not having a sense of independence. She was a fiercely independent woman, and her husband was a bit more codependent. Daphne would say that she felt like she couldn't leave Tommy for very long. She couldn't be by herself. She couldn't be without him because he had these awful, nervy fits of misery, 10 times worse than Daddy's old horrors. She's referring to her father's drinking problem, and she said that these nervous fits all harked back to that beastly war. Although the war was 14 years in the past, memories of the conflict still made Daphne's husband wake up in the middle of the night screaming. He would wake up in the middle of the night from these violent nightmares, and she would say, "He clings to me, just like a terrified little boy." It wrings one's heart. Daphne really struggled to reconcile how her husband could be this masculine force in the day. He would command troops of men, he would give them orders and they would follow them, and he was respected. But at night, due to the horrors he had witnessed and participated in during the First World War, he would sob uncontrollably. Daphne struggled with this because, as she would say, she had very little of the nurturing side in her, and she needed a sense of independence, which actually means she needed another to not be dependent upon her. Ultimately, and sadly, both of them ended up having infidelities across the course of their marriage, and she was seemingly replaying the dynamic that she saw modelled in her parents' marriage. She struggled not only with her marriage, but with motherhood too. She had wanted 6 boys, but she ended up getting 2 daughters first before she had her first son. And Daphne found not only the ordeal of pregnancy itself too much to bear, but she also found herself crushed by postnatal depression, and then struggling to look after more dependents. No longer just a husband struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, which at that time people didn't properly understand, but now she had to look after her babies too. And she longed incessantly to reclaim her sense of solitude. She wished to be alone walking through nature, and to be losing herself in her imaginative literature. But unfortunately, Daphne would find further struggles in the form of her writing no longer being just fully healing and escapist as it had initially been, but of course her fiction became a means of making money. They say, don't do what you love, or you will soon hate it. Now, I don't believe she ever hated it, but she had a very understandable stress attached to the fact that she was the breadwinner of the family, with her husband's army salary paling in comparison to her bestseller earnings. This put enormous pressure on her, and she lost sleep, wondering what might happen if her mind stopped working. That's quite a burden to think, if I stop, then the family will suffer. So now she needed to write, not just as a way of healing herself and retreating into this imaginative world, but she needed to write from a pragmatic and financial point of view too. Almost a century prior to time of recording, Daphne was discovering the incomprehensible burden that faces many women today. The expectation, no longer the right that was fought for and secured, but the expectation of needing to have it all, which sounds to me like a recipe for a nervous breakdown. Now, in 1938, Daphne and her husband moved away from England for Tommy's work in the army. Daphne was 30 years old and she was pregnant with her second daughter. They were stationed in Alexandria, Egypt, for Captain Browning's work in the Grenadier Guards. Now, for about 5 years, everything in Daphne's life had been gestating and steadily coming together in what would become her best-selling and most iconic work, her 5th novel. Everything in her life, her marriage, her grief, her longing for England, her longing for Cornwall specifically, and of course the memories of the estate that would eventually become her home, Menabilly. It would be thanks to the success of this novel that 17 years after first seeing and falling in love with the Menabilly estate, Daphne could afford to lease it, and she would live there for 20 years. And it would become everything she had imagined. She would talk of being in love with the house and wanting to hug the walls. She would say that the house and I are one. She would talk about how the walls would whisper secrets, and she would imagine the historical figures that might have lived there, and she could really get into character. She could get into the mindset of her characters, who would find themselves living in similarly romantic abodes. But all of this, the inspiration for this book, all of it came together in the heat of Alexandria. And talk about a very different climate. Egypt is very, very hot, and England, as you likely know, very much isn't. We're lucky to have a few weeks out of the year, although this is getting more so in recent years. We're lucky if we have a little bit of a summer. More recently, we actually had 4 heat waves. But now it's autumn, autumn's here, the heavens are raining, it all is wet and lush and chilly. It's quite a chilly little rock that we inhabit, and this is particularly so when you're on the coast. It's moody, it's atmospheric, there's mists coming in from the sea. Daphne, like me, loved all of that. And so she missed her home when they were stationed in Alexandria, and you can really feel the homesickness and the heartache bursting out of this novel. Cornwall may not be named explicitly, but it is absolutely everywhere in its pages. We can feel homesickness, we can feel jealousy, we can feel grief and trauma, and it all feels so truthful. We say that fiction is a lie that tells the truth. This is the greatest biography you will get of Daphne at a moment in time. Each book that a writer produces says something about who they are when they wrote it. All of these painful feelings were almost unbearable for Daphne. So unbearable, in fact, that she wrote 15,000 words of the first draft and then destroyed it, tearing it to shreds. I'm reminded of Robert Louis Stevenson, who did a similar thing with The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. His problem with that story was it was too demonic, it was too scary, and so he cast it into the fire and then needed to rewrite that. We'll be talking about Jekyll and Hyde around the Halloween season this year, because once we've gotten through Rebecca together around Halloween time, we'll be talking Jekyll and Hyde. So if you're reading along with us, you will be able to compare the modern Gothic with the late Victorian Gothic and see the similarities and differences. It will be really complementary. So Daphne initially destroyed the first manuscript and needed to begin again. She began the book in Egypt and she ultimately finished it in England. Before the book was even finished, there was already a great buzz around it, and film studios started sniffing around and talking to her publisher, and it would be the immortal Alfred Hitchcock who would adapt the novel. He also adapted Jamaica and The Birds for film. Hitchcock loved the works of Daphne du Maurier, and it's not hard to see why. And Hitchcock's film came out very swiftly after the publication of the novel, and that really helped shoot her even further into superstardom. In interview, du Maurier would liken writing to pregnancy, labour, and giving birth. She would talk about the gestation of the idea. It could take 9 months, and then she would talk about the delivery and how the delivery could be painful, but at the end of it you would have something very rewarding. Now, when she spoke about destroying the first manuscript, she referred to this as a literary miscarriage. And one might think that although she did struggle with motherhood and thought herself to be without the nurturing impulse, it's clear that she did have motherly impulses. They were just channeled into her fiction. She had a lot of people and things to nurture in her life. I think Daphne was ultimately rather hard on herself because she did nurture, and she nurtures us today. This is why we come to Rebecca time and again. This is the sort of book where you need to stay away from plot spoilers because it really hinges around not knowing what's going to happen, and yet it's also a book where even if you know what happens, you absolutely can and should reread it. We come back to this work because there's something healing and life-sustaining in it. Ironically for all the darkness and gloom. So a lot of nurturing went into her fiction and a lot of pain too. And the pregnancy figuration is very telling and it's very interesting. Pregnancy is a theme in Rebecca. Now the thing is, in Alexandria, du Maurier found it very difficult trying to balance what she felt were her double lives. On the one hand, she was naturally shy and reclusive, and she was an artist. She was a writer with a fluid sexuality. But on the other hand, she needed to play the role of the officer's wife. She needed to host these big parties. As her husband's tour was ending, they would have all these different parties to send the soldiers back home. And so she needed to play this gregarious, audacious role that she felt her husband's previous partner would have been able to step into more sincerely than herself. She just wanted to be alone and she wanted to write. And in the heat of Alexandria, she struggled to sleep. She would rely on sleeping pills to get her to bed. She saw these two selves as being completely incompatible with one another, and she really felt herself to be more aligned with the dreamer, the artist, the writer, the storyteller. And thus, an identity crisis was ripping through her life with full force, whilst at the very same time a global crisis was looming over the world. As we've said, Rebecca was published in 1938, which means it's a product of the Interwar Years. The publication of Rebecca was sandwiched in between two world wars. You got the First World War as the backdrop of du Maurier's early adolescence, and it would be just 1 year after the publication of this work that England would be forced to declare war on Nazi Germany. It's very interesting because in this book we've got this endless meditation on time, the past, memory, and we might think that people at the time wanted to go back to the past, to reclaim a lost or forgotten or buried past that actually wasn't that far back at all. There's a real nostalgia for a slightly older, more twee England, which speaks to the anxiety of the time. Now, to anyone reflecting upon this, one might ask, how can the Second World War be an influence on this book when it kicked off 1 year after publication? We can of course understand the shadow of the not too distant past of the First World War intruding into it, but surely the Second World War couldn't have gotten into the fabric of this book. Well, in a sense, it absolutely did. This was the climate of the time, and to anyone paying attention, in 1938 it was already pretty clear that war was inevitable and it was on the not too distant horizon. Hitler rose to power in 1933, and his German expansion was incredibly apparent by 1938 as his troops marched into Austria and annexed the country in March of that year. And Tommy certainly knew all about the spectre that was looming over the world, and he and Daphne discussed it deeply, and with great concern he knew what Winston Churchill knew, that Britain was very ill prepared for another war. Indeed, the British Army were not prepared in the slightest. The nation were not prepared, and one cannot emphasise enough just how thoroughly England did not want another war. War was declared in September of 1939 when Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's attempt at peace failed, and the mood in the nation was beyond sober. You can listen to those historic radio recordings and you can feel just how crushingly depressed people were. The thing is, the country was still economically devastated from the war 2 decades prior, and the citizens still carried the scars with them everywhere they went. We spoke recently in a lecture on Homer's Odyssey about how scars are your identity. Scars contain stories. There's stories about who you are, and the nation really did have a lot of scars from the First World War. The fatigue from fighting was still there, even over 2 decades on, and this next war would not be called Great. It would become known as the Heroes' War, but this was a nation that had, by this point, seen through a lot of the propaganda, and they were not excited about this in the slightest. And the Second World War was a very different war from the first, not only in scale, and of course, who could have thought at the time that they could top the death count that they'd seen in the First World War. The death toll when it came to World War I was about 15 to 20 million deaths, but World War II we have conservative estimates at around 75 to 80 million deaths. It was a different war, not only in scale but in tone. The First World War was truly senseless. I really do think it's one of the most senseless conflicts the world has ever seen, whereas the Second World War felt like a real obligation, and it felt very much like a fight between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Now, Daphne's husband Tommy had predicted that war would be declared by the end of summer of 1939. And of course he would be right. Daphne would end up working in the Civil Defence Department at the First Aid Post, and she would prepare to deal with casualties from gas attacks. Throughout the war, she wrote stories to comfort people, stories with a maternal tone that appeared in the newspapers. Her stories were branded as stories from a mother with great faith. And she would compile these stories into a booklet, and she considered this one of her forms of national service, with the proceeds going to the Red Cross. She implored people in these stories to listen to the voice within them and to have faith, and yet this was quite at odds with how she truly felt. Her husband had great faith in God and faith in good triumphing over evil, and that's why he was able to go back into battle despite his PTSD from the First World War, because he believed that good would win out. Du Maurier was less sure about all of this. She thought that the individual was responsible for putting their faith in themselves, and she felt in herself the crisis of faith that would become very much characteristic of the era itself, the century at large. And it's not hard to see why one would experience such a crisis. Even though she was incredibly successful, her books were earning a ton of money and she was getting a ton of critical acclaim, it does not matter how much money you have if bombs are falling from the sky, and if your home and the world is being ripped apart. And indeed, one of the most haunting short stories I have ever read is Daphne du Maurier's The Birds. And you likely know of the story. The avian world goes berserk and starts dive bombing people and attacking people. Conceptually, it's a really terrifying concept. If you go out and you see how many birds there are around, imagine them in full force as a collective, just suicidally bent on killing humans. What's even more terrifying is the fact that these birds are a clear metaphor for the Blitz, and they symbolise the bombs that were falling across England, and the fear of many that the day would come, and maybe quite soon, when there would be radio silence, and you would find yourself all alone in a world completely, utterly and senselessly destroyed. So if you haven't read The Birds, give it a read and watch the Hitchcock film. It's incredible, chilling stuff. Now, I give this historical and biographical background to help us explore the popularity of the novel Rebecca, because Du Maurier managed to channel her individual anxieties, which themselves were universal. And I give all of this so as to segue now into an appreciation of the genre Du Maurier was working within. The genre that is my personal favourite genre, and that, of course, is the Gothic. Du Maurier might be a modern writer, but her storytelling has its roots in a very deep and enduring tradition, and she has a lot more in common with the Bronte sisters, for example, than, say, the Bloomsbury group, with writers like Virginia Woolf, or writers like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. Now, we can see some surface parallels and some psychological commonalities when it comes to the works of Du Maurier and Virginia Woolf, but aesthetically they are polar opposite, because these writers are modernists in a way that Daphne du Maurier is not. When I think of du Maurier, I don't think modernist. Writers like Joyce and Woolf, they were exemplary of modernism as a movement, and that means a lot of their works were exclusive and elitist. They very self-consciously put a hedge up around their works and lent into a serious level of difficulty, which presented a barrier for what Virginia Woolf would call the common reader. Around the same time that we're getting these incredible prose experiments and this incredibly allegorical and dense and abstract and expressionist poetry, we were also getting books that were bestsellers and were enormously popular and very easy to read and very digestible. Du Maurier was plugging in to that. And just like her friend and contemporary, Agatha Christie, Daphne du Maurier was writing quintessential page-turners. But the thing is, the Gothic has always given us page turners, and when I say the word Gothic, what comes to mind immediately for you? You most likely think of the tropes of the genre, and a trope is a recurring generic feature that marks a work as belonging to a particular family. You likely think of certain architectural features. Now, when we talk of Gothic architecture, here we're not referring to actual architecture, we are referring to the kinds of buildings we find in Gothic novels, which is a little bit different. What kind of architecture do we find in Gothic novels? Well, we find castles, really old castles. We find crumbling abbeys, crypts, convents, and ancient estates. And the Gothic also gives us some interesting geographical features too. We find ruins and rocks, we find mountains and valleys, and amongst these valleys, crumbling towers, and we find haunted caves. Now, there is a formulation, or indeed a two-part formulation, for unlocking the Gothic, so to speak. The first part is to understand that the Gothic is set in antiquated and crumbling ancient locales that are haunted by the secrets of the past. And there's a biblical maxim that could very well be the byline of Gothic literature. The sins of the fathers will be visited upon the next generation. And the second part of the formulation is this. Although set in antiquated spaces, or taking place in the past, and often taking place in exotic and distant locales, although set in antiquated places, the Gothic always has something to say about the present. And I get this pithy formulation from my undergraduate Oxford tutor, Dr. James Methven, who was infectiously obsessed with all things Gothic, particularly the fin de siècle, decadent and decaying late Victorian Gothic, of which the vampire subgenre is a delightful standout. So, the Gothic is set in antiquated spaces that are haunted by the secrets of the past. So the past is never truly dead. It's not buried, it comes back into the present. So we hang out in these old locales and are haunted by what has happened in the past, and the characters who inhabit these spaces are haunted. Now, the Gothic has really ancient roots, and what we call Gothic elements can be recognised in the oldest tales, from Beowulf all the way up through to Macbeth. But the Gothic as we know it really properly kicked off from around the time of the French Revolution. We're talking the late 18th century, and the Gothic was responding to the enormous violence taking place across France. The Marquis de Sade would say that Gothic novels were the necessary fruits of the revolutionary tremors felt by the whole of Europe. Gothic novels were a way of confronting and dealing with and thinking through the violence being witnessed in real life. That's one of the many blessings and gifts of fiction. Literature allows you to confront that which terrifies you. Now, the very first work to call itself a Gothic story was actually a few decades prior to the Revolution, and that's Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, which came out in 1764. But we really do see the most incredible explosion of Gothic novels right around the turn of the century. In 1794, we have The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, or Mother Radcliffe, as John Keats would say, and she was the mother of the sublime. And that work gives us these really resplendent, rolling, indulgent and sublime descriptions of moody, atmospheric and pathetic fallacy-stuffed locales. In 1796, we have another iconic work of Gothic literature with Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which is a tale of murder, incest, violence and madness. These are thematic tropes that we see time and again, and we see that the Gothic is ultimately a perverted or corrupted quest romance. We have spoken about romance as a genre a lot in the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We've spoken about the Gothic a lot too. Indeed, earlier this year we read William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, which is a really powerful representative of the Southern Gothic, where instead of crumbling European castles, the secrets of the past in the Southern Gothic, in American literature, they haunt the plantations. But we've spoken about romance a lot. This year, very recently, we read through Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers together. We also explored realism, because realism is also indebted to romance because it was pitting itself against romance. We've seen that this year in the form of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, which is a complementary work for Rebecca. We might think of the two wives, the two Madame Bovarys in that novel. We've also talked about how Geoffrey Chaucer wrote romance and medieval dream vision. Again, very complementary when it comes to Rebecca. Now, romance can be defined structurally. Let's think about a few of the main broad sweeps generic forms. Comedy, for example. A comedy is a comedy because it ends in marriage. It has a happy ending. So historically and traditionally, when one talks of comedy, they are referring first and foremost not to the fact that the work is stuffed with jokes, though of course it is. They are referring to the fact that it ends with marriage and on a happy note. The ending defines the genre. We often see in Shakespeare that his tragedies could well be comedies until the ending, and the same is true for the comedies too. They feel quite tragic in substance. Now, a case in point is Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. What's a tragedy? Well, a tragedy is a tragedy because the stage or page is awash with blood at the very end. For a case study, if you want a great tragedy, probably the greatest tragedy, then of course read or watch Hamlet. And we have lectures for all of Shakespeare's plays at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Now, romance is a curious form because it feels like a blend of the two, comedy and tragedy. You've got love and expressions of love throughout, but there's also death and destruction. And yet a romance typically ends on a note of renewal, rebirth, the idea of dying and rising again. There's renewal, reunion and rebirth in a romance, and at time of recording we've just wrapped up our deep reading of Homer's Odyssey together, which I see as the great original when it comes to romance. We feel Homer everywhere when it comes to romances in the Western tradition. And we can also see the Christian religion, the Christian framework, as being fundamentally romantic in tone. Because Christ is crucified, he dies, and he rises again. That's what romance is about, rising again, going through trials. It's the hero's journey and rising again. A case in point for Shakespeare, a really exemplary romance, would be The Winter's Tale. Gothic takes that and corrupts it. It puts romance through a dark blender. Not only that, but in romance, classically and historically speaking, we have the iconic and defining image of a knight in shining armour undertaking a quest with great perils in order to save a damsel in distress. They either save the damsel in distress or they go out on a quest in service of their lady. And this was a narrative whose conventions had become cliché, thoroughly cliché in fact, by the time of Cervantes and Shakespeare. Both of them parody the romance tradition. We see the conventions of romance are parodied relentlessly in Cervantes' Don Quixote, one of my favourite novels. I think it's incredible that the birth of the modern novel, or what would lead to the modern novel as we know it, bloomed out of comedy and parody and satire and twisting it all and turning it on its head. And if you want to read Don Quixote and you want my commentary on it, then we have a lecture series in the back catalogue at Patreon too. In the Gothic, we see that a woman protagonist takes on increasing autonomy. And rather than having a man going up to a castle to save a woman trapped inside it, we increasingly see that it is the woman, not the man, who is placed at the centre of Gothic romance. They are at the centre of what ultimately becomes a very female fantasy. Women become the heroines, they become the central protagonist, and rather than have a man come up and save them from the castle, we see that they save themselves and get themselves out of the castle. And so romance as a genre is kind of like moving from the outside in to come back again. So it's circular, and where you end up is where you began. There's a cyclicality to romance, and we find that cyclicality in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca too. But in Gothic, the Gothic flavour of romance, we see it's an inside-out genre. And centre stage, we have a woman who is escaping from an antiquated locale. So it's all about escaping from the darkness of the past and the sins of the past. And this reaches its iconic zenith right at the end of the 19th century with Bram Stoker's Dracula. Again, we have a lecture series at patreon.com/hardcore literature. If you're in the mood for a great read around Halloween time, then check out our lecture series on that. But in Bram Stoker's Dracula, we see that Jonathan Harker is like the damsel in distress. And I say that the Gothic becomes a female fantasy, but this is not to say that this isn't a genre that men take no delight in. I'm a perfect case in point. I absolutely love the Gothic. And seeing a heroine at the centre of the conflict, seeing increased autonomy with women personages and characters, this is also a type of male fantasy too, but for different reasons. Men and women will read the Gothic and they'll probably get different things out of it. I think men like this, and even today we see that we have heroines aplenty at the centre of our favourite stories who kick ass. I think men like this because there's a male fantasy of wanting a woman who can be your friends. And our friends are those we can depend on. I think love stories are ultimately buddy stories. There's that same impulse that we find in Don Quixote when we see the friendship between the knight-errant and faithful squire Sancho Panza, who talk to each other and can be on one another's level. We find that in the novels of Jane Austen. What happens in Jane Austen's novels? Well, everybody gets their perfect match. And the perfect match is somebody who's on your level, not better than you, not worse than you, on your level, and who can be your friend and companion intellectually. And I think that's what men want. Most men, most sensitive thinking and intellectual men, do not just want a woman who looks good or a woman to bear his children. A man wants somebody who can satisfy him intellectually too. So I think that's why we see that men absolutely adore many of these stories that put women at the centre of the action. But of course it's going to be a female fantasy because here is a story in which you really can step into the heroine's shoes. Typically, the central protagonist is like a surrogate for the reader. We want to like them, we want to be them. Sometimes we tear our hair out and we find them maddening. You may find that with Rebecca. I'd love to know what you think as we read through the book together at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Interestingly, I've noticed that different readers will have different reactions to the women in this book. So, of course, women are going to love this book because they are at the centre of the narrative, but also you've got the love interest is a male one. So you're not needing to read a book where the love interest is a woman. You can really lose yourself in the work. Not only that, but in the Gothic, the love interest is typically quite dangerous and mysterious. So Gothic texts have familiar tropes and they have recurring archetypes too. And the most relentlessly recurring archetype for Gothic literature is that of the Byronic anti-hero, the moody, brooding, darkly masculine force who can overwhelm you but also needs to be nurtured. So there's something exciting in the fact that a man is so dangerous that, yes, he can pose a threat to you, but that means he can also protect you. But there's also that double impulse of needing to look after a tortured spirit. So we see this in anti-heroes like Emily Bronte's Heathcliff or her sister Charlotte's Rochester, though indeed Rochester is less deranged, let's put it that way, than Heathcliff. The Byronic anti-heroes of Gothic literature have a raw animal magnetism to them. They solicit this raw attraction. Attraction that's like a force of nature. Here's the description we get of Max de Winter in du Maurier's Rebecca, by the way. You tell me if he sounds like a Byronic anti-hero. We're told he looks ill and tortured, and we're told that he belonged to a walled city of the 15th century, a city of narrow cobbled streets and thin spires, where the inhabitants wore pointed shoes and worsted hose. His face was arresting, sensitive, medieval in some strange, inexplicable way, and I was reminded of a portrait seen in a gallery, I'd forgotten where, of a certain gentleman unknown. Could one but rob him of his English tweeds and put him in black, with lace at his throat and wrists, he would stare down at us in our new world from a long distant past, a past where men walked cloaked at night and stood in the shadow of old doorways, a past of narrow stairways and dim dungeons, a past of whispers in the dark, of shimmering rapier blades, of silent, exquisite courtesy. So we have these dark, Byronic anti-heroes in the Gothic, and that's packaged up with riveting adventure, melodrama, and poetic descriptions of atmospheric locales. Another reason for the form as quite a feminine, female, and, as I'll make comment upon in a moment, feminist form, when it comes to the Gothic, another reason for the popularity with women readers was due to the fact that the writers were women. Women writers were gravitating to the form. Now, it's true that many of them adopted male pen names, like the Bronte sisters, but we see the rise of the Gothic coincided with the rise of the novel itself and the rise of a much more diverse reading public. Interestingly, Gothic and novel were seen as almost interchangeable descriptors very early on, and when people talked of novels, they frequently did so with their noses in the air because they thought instinctively of what we now call Gothic, and they dismissed it as popular, fast entertainment, not the kinds of poetry that the aristocrats would enjoy. And this is why we see Jane Austen launching a defence of novels in her parody Gothic work Northanger Abbey, and we will be discussing Jane Austen this year, right after reading Rebecca at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Emma is going to be our third Austen, our third book club Austen. We have read Persuasion, we have read Pride and Prejudice, and now we're moving on to Emma. Lectures still available for those first two at time of recording in the back catalogue at patreon.com/hardcore literature. The reading public rose and the Gothic rose with it in tandem, and we see across the course of the 19th century a dramatic rise in literacy across the classes, and you get a lot of class anxiety come through in Daphne du Maurier's 20th century novel, because that was still very much there in the culture, and Rebecca's very much in tone a hark back to those Victorian novels, whilst simultaneously making a distinctly 1930s comment on how the country was seeing an erosion of aristocratic and class dynamics. We see that from one end of the century to the next, reading went from being a pursuit of the aristocrat class to something that the working classes could read and write too. We see an explosion of literacy and an explosion of downtime, and also increased disposable income, with greater affordability and availability for stories. With the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the railway, the nation became a nation of readers, and books were portable portals of escapism that could make your journey or your commute into work go by in the blink of an eye. And so they were a miraculous invention, and readers who wanted that deep absorption and escapism would often find themselves pulled to the kinds of melodramatic tales that were typical of the Gothic form. And how did Gothic writers pull readers out of themselves? Well, they made them feel the sublime. They put them in touch with the sublime by arousing feelings of terror in them. This is another defining feature of the Gothic, and would remain so through Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, on into Dracula and into Rebecca. And Edmund Burke would define the sublime as that which inspires terror or feelings of fear or awe. And indeed, Gothic novels were originally referred to as terrorist novels or terror novels, and Anne Radcliffe would delineate the difference between terror and horror, saying that terror was the superior emotion, and above all else the Gothic writers should pursue terror before they pursue horror. What's the difference? Well, terror is the feeling of foreboding and anticipation as you get closer to the horrific thing. So terror is the feeling you have when you go down into the crypt and you get closer to the buried dead. Horror is the feeling you get when the terrible thing happens. So you're down in the crypt and a hand grabs hold of you. That's horror. And the best Gothic novels truly are the ones that crank up that feeling of foreboding, that feeling of terror. The sublime is when you are in the presence of that which could overwhelm you, overpower you, or indeed kill you. And the sublime is mediated through art. Terrifying things, when you're reading about them in a novel or viewing a painting, become delightful because they are at a sufficient distance from you so that you can appreciate their power, and you can appreciate just how devastating they would be if you were actually confronting them. What are some examples of the sublime? Well, rushing waterfalls, huge stony mountains, dark forests at night filled with wild animals. We find all of this in the sublime, and anything that excites fear in the imagination typically has its roots in what we call the sublime. And so we find a great indulgence in descriptions of the wild natural world in Gothic works. Think of the moors in Wuthering Heights, and the sublime violence of the gusts that blow across the moors. All of that is a dark, profound metaphor for the violence of the love, the passion that Heathcliff has for Cathy. And we love the sublime, I think, because when we are in the presence of something mighty, or when we are in the presence of something bigger or greater than ourselves, it makes us feel small. We love that because it makes our problems feel small. If you want a tonic for any anxiety you're going through, go out at night and look up at the night sky filled with stars, and you will feel yourself relax a little bit. This is what a lot of great writers are trying to get in their works. They want to increase the tension so as to purge through something that needs to be purged through. Now, there was also a war between romance, of which Gothic is an offshoot, and realism as the novel arose. People either gravitated to the works of writers like Horace Walpole and Anne Radcliffe, or they would gravitate to the works of Samuel Richardson. In the mid-18th century, painstaking realism had become vogue because it was different. A great example comes in the form of Clarissa. Again, we have a lecture series for Clarissa at the book club, and novels like Clarissa had very little in the way of external conflict. They had a few bits of external conflict, of course, but they didn't have a ton of it, and yet they could still grip readers serially across the course of months for thousands of pages because they had a powerful detailing of internal conflict. But with the Gothic, we see that writers wanted to return to the fantastical, and the history of literature is kind of like a seesaw, back and forth, and anytime the swing goes one way, it brings a little bit of what it's reacting to with it, a little bit of detritus, and back and forth they go. And so you get these iterations, and you start to see that the Gothic, though it retains its melodrama and its exciting incidents, and it's packed with novel adventure, the Gothic also becomes a rather inward form too. We start to get these psychological examinations of the central protagonists as they're going through the traumatic incidents. And we start to see that the heroines of the Gothic form are not just navigating a perilous external world, but they are navigating a perilous and terrifying inner world too. The thing is as well, works of realism were often didactic and moralistic. That can certainly be said for Samuel Richardson. And they were designed to be like teaching tales, teaching the public how to live. But romance and fantasy and Gothic, this was all pure imagination and escapism for its own sake, and we love that. But also, the Gothic writers knew that through the fantastical, one could make profound social and political comment. Why do late 18th century Gothic works take place in crumbling, antiquated spaces? Because they allegorically reflect the abstract but very real social structures that were crumbling, like that of the Ancien regime in France. The Gothic became a vehicle to launch criticism at the corrupt who hold the reins of power. And the most popular institution that the Gothic would lambast in the late 18th century was the Roman Catholic Church. And that's why you see in these early Gothic works, we see the archetypes of the lascivious friar. We find sinful monks and mad, murderous bishops. But as the 19th century moved on, and at the heights of Queen Victoria's reign, we see that the Gothic became a profoundly proto-feminist genre. It became a form in which women could righteously launch their angry female dissent against the bonds that keep them tied. And what was the most glaring societal bond working against women of this age? Well, if you turn to the Gothic works of the century, from the likes of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte to Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, you will find your answer. It was marriage. In the 19th century in England, we can see that marriage was very much a social structure that disproportionately favoured men, and would continue to do so legally right up until the time that du Maurier was writing. But in the Victorian era, neither party, once married, could obtain a divorce easily, but it was much more easy for a man. Adultery or infidelity was a sufficient reason for divorce for a man, but not for a woman. That would not be a good enough reason and would not be allowed. So it was a biased institution from 1857 through to 1923, when the Matrimonial Causes Act was amended. Then it was amended again in 1937, and then we had the Divorce Reform Act in 1969. And despite the institution's bias against women, men still had a great cultural pressure to keep their marriage intact, no matter what. And for public figures of a certain class, there was always the terrible fear of scandal. And historically, before custody laws evolved, in the event of a divorce, in the event that you could even get one, it's very much not like today, where the woman is the de facto main guardian of the children, but rather the father would retain control of their kids. And contrary to common belief, women could own property in the 19th century, and many did, and they could have their own money. But upon marriage is when that property went to the man and her money became the man's money. From then on, any property she entered the marriage with or any income was only hers by extension of it being her husband's. And culturally, we see that women would be defined always as in relation to a man, or they'd be defined by their lack of a relation to a man. You were either a wife, or you were a widow, or indeed if you didn't marry, you would be an old maid. Everything you were was because of what you were to a man. And whilst working class women have always been in employment, for women of a certain class, employment options for those who didn't want to be a wife were severely limited. The main recourse for women to earn their own money without getting married, if they were in the middle class, was to work as a governess. And thus we see a profusion of governess stories in the Victorian Gothic tradition, again from Jane Eyre to Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, and we see in the 20th century with Rebecca, she extends this tradition, she's part of it, except her unnamed narrator, her heroine, is a paid companion. And Simone de Beauvoir would say, no one is a woman, but rather becomes one through social conditions. It's profound stuff, though we might say that Charlotte Bronte got there first, circuitously, in her Jane Eyre. And what is that novel about? If you want to read Jane Eyre and you want my commentary and you want to see what fellow readers have made of that novel, you can check out our lecture series for Jane Eyre at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We also have a lecture series for Sister Emily's Wuthering Heights, and Jane Eyre is an incredibly complimentary work for Rebecca. Not only that, but it has historically been one of the most popular book club reads, so I highly recommend it. Jane Eyre was a landmark work, and it gave us the first significant unravelling of a young woman's complex persona, her inward and outward persona, and a persona that had to develop in a typically male world. This entire novel, Jane Eyre, is about the narrator's identity crisis and how she valiantly and defiantly forges her own identity in a world in which being a woman meant being so thoroughly dependent upon one's husband. Charlotte raised a rallying cry for women's rights without formally doing so. There's no formal cry, but it steams off the page. In lieu of being able to cast a vote, her novel becomes her political statement, her political argument, her demand to be considered and respected as equal to a man. Without Jane Eyre, perhaps we don't have the great heroines of Thomas Hardy's novels, nor do we have the deep concerns for female independence that come through in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. In fact, since publication, Rebecca has been read as a complementary work and as an overt response to Jane Eyre. Sally Bowman, who wrote a novel extending the story of Rebecca. Sally Bowman, finding this interesting literary mirroring between these two books, would say that this was one of the earliest examples of intertextuality and one that is still very rare in a popular novel. Bowman says, Rebecca reflects Jane Eyre, but the reflection is imperfect and deliberately so, forcing us to re-examine our assumptions about both novels and in particular their treatment of insanity and women. Bowman continues and says, what interested du Maurier as a novelist can be summarised by the distinction that Charlotte Bronte drew between writing that was real and writing that was true. There is realism in Rebecca. You've got the mores, the snobberies, and speech patterns of the class and era du Maurier is describing. All of these are sharply observed, but the elements that give Rebecca its force, however, owe nothing to realism. Its power lies in its imagery, its symmetry, its poetry, and that poetry is intensely female. The plot of Rebecca may be as unlikely as the plot of a fairy tale, but that does not alter the novel's mythic resonance and psychological truth. Rebecca, Bowman says, is an intensely subversive work and is ultimately a work of angry female dissent. Now, when you pair that with storytelling techniques that are enduring and as old as time, because indeed you do see a contortion of fairy tale themes and motifs, there's a lot of Cinderella, there's a lot of Bluebeard coming through in Rebecca. When you do all of that, you hit a very strong nerve with readers. Readers will come to Rebecca and many will say, hey, that's how I feel. You will find something of yourself in this book. So the writer of Gothic is a social force and has social concerns, and we get that in Rebecca too. Gothic is pretty much always popular literature because it explores the popular ideas of the time. So what's really interesting is we start to see in the Victorian era a distinction in the Gothic where the form undergoes an evolution. It undergoes these different shifts and changes. So early Gothic, you've got the revolutionary fervour and you've got a societal fear, and what you've got a fear of is ultimately physical, a fear of physical harm, being maimed, being killed, being undone. By the Victorian era, however, we start to see that the threat that one fears is no longer just physical, but the primary threat becomes the threat to one's sense of identity or one's sense of self. The terrifying idea at the heart of the Victorian Gothic, which continues into the modern age, is the question of who am I? Who will I become, and what will this, what I am enduring and up against, what will it do to me. And as we've said before, in lectures on Homer's Odyssey, all the way up to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, if you write a book that is intensely individual, probing into your anxieties, then you are inevitably going to connect with the universal. The formulation that comes through emphatically in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca is a Rambodian one, from the French symbolist poet who died tragically young, Arthur Rimbaud, who said, "I is another," or "I is somebody else." There is not a stable sense of unified self in Rebecca, and this creates unease in us from the very first page. We have this constant sense of almost schizophrenic identity crisis, this schism in self throughout the book. Very frequently our narrator will say things like this: "I began to feel more like the self I wanted to become, the self I had pictured in my dreams, who made Manderley her home." Isn't that fascinating? The self I wanted to become. Who is the I who observes the self? Who is that sense of you? So the book is about this young, naive girl who marries an older man. She's in her early 20s, he's in his 40s, and he has lost his wife tragically and suddenly. And that is very publicly known about. And he lost her less than a year before he meets this young woman. We see he's very much of the aristocrat class, and we see this real exploration with the burgeoning culture of journalism that was taking off across the 1920s and 30s, in which the private lives of these aristocratic individuals, which had always been secret and scandals had always been covered up, were suddenly being thrust into the limelight. So she meets this man who, by all accounts, has been an absolute emotional wreck, and he's gone away to Monte Carlo to get away from Manderley. He's trying to escape his past, his not too distant past, his recent past. But as anyone who has travelled knows, wherever you go, you and your problems go with you. You can't run from yourself. And we see, he meets our heroine, who's working as a companion, again the 20th century version of a governess tale, we might say, and obviously du Maurier is exploring issues of class with that. When he meets her, we the readers see this as a very serious and obvious rebound. The problem is that this young girl doesn't know herself. She's not lived enough, she's not old enough to know herself. Now, she's very artistic and creative and sensitive, but she just doesn't know the world and other people very well. And one thing that we've learnt from our reading of great literature at the Hardcore Literature Book Club is we read to be in the company of others, because knowledge of others is knowledge of self. This is what Montaigne said in his essays. He said, "The reason that I know myself so well is because I know others and vice versa." So she's very, very young. And so when his proposal comes, she thinks it's normal, that it's completely devoid of all traditional semblance of romance, the kind of romance that she had come to expect from reading books. She thinks, well, this might be normal, and she starts to rationalise in her mind, well, he's just more pragmatic, he's not treating me like other girls, he's not treating me insincerely, he loves me. But then she starts to wonder, but how was it with his first wife? Was he more romantic with her? Did he treat her better? Did he love her more than me? She starts to find herself, when she goes to Manderley, competing with a dead woman for her very existential meaning. And whilst all of this is going on, you've got a real blend, which is very distinct to the Gothic, of the ancient and the modern. So you've got the modern infusion, where you see our characters driving around in motor cars, and you've got the new world taking off, but you've also got the past, the old, nostalgic, class-bound past, and there's a tension there, a tension that was made all the more apparent writing in the shadow of the First World War, with the second one on the near horizon. So even though this is a modern work, when we come to Manderley, we've got this really creepy, old, Victorian feeling to it. And in early Gothic works, we would read about literal imprisonment in these antiquated abodes. Characters would literally be kidnapped, or they would be shackled, and they would often be kept in crypts or castles against their will. But when we get to the modern era, the prison becomes a prison of one's mind, and the shackles become the shackles of societal convention. And we see that the Gothic really does rise in tandem with feminism. Gilbert and Guba, in their 1979 influential classic of feminist criticism, The Mad Woman in the Attic, would agree with me that the Gothic is one of the genres most fertile to exploring feminist philosophy. And they would say that almost all 19th century women were in some sense imprisoned in men's houses. And this was the concern of the era. Again, we've seen this time and again with book club reads. And this carries through to the 20th century. And we see this real anxiety about losing one's sense of independence upon marriage to a man. The Gothic is all about escaping from bondage and making your way towards freedom and liberation. And there is self-understanding and a sense of self-identity at the end of that adventure. Look at the name of the estate that Maxim de Winter takes his new bride to. It's called Manderley. Notice that first syllable, Manderley. The same can be said for Menabilly. This is a masculine abode which becomes a kind of abstract prison, and we see that Manderley is very much a structure filled with the haunting secrets of the past. So the woman, our heroine, is entering the man's world, and she's about to discover a thing or two about herself and who he really is. It's all the more profound to note that she's entering a world where another woman has been before her, a woman who has been named and defined by her relation to this man of the house. And this is so striking in Rebecca that one can hardly fail to miss it. The house staff constantly refer to Mrs. de Winter when talking to the unnamed narrator, but they're not referring to her, they are referring to the dead wife, they are referring to Rebecca, even though she is technically now Mrs. de Winter. And critics have wondered why du Maurier refrained from naming the narrator in her work at all, but du Maurier would defend this device, and I do too. I think it gives us a really powerful comment. And it's incredible how we have a structure, Manderley, that becomes almost a character unto itself. And then the dominating presence of the book is a woman who we never actually meet, a woman who is dead, who's passed. We don't see her, we just hear about her. She's not alive for the book, but she survives and is kept alive on the tongue of the characters and in the mind of our narrator, who actually didn't know her at all. She becomes a phantom in her mind, and this is really, really important because what she knows of her is only what she thinks she knows of her, and it's all projection. She makes this persona, this composite persona in her mind that's based on her anxieties and her fears and her desires, and we all do this. And so what we have in this work is a radical example of an unreliable narrator in fiction, just like in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And we enter Manderley, and it feels like we're entering a labyrinthine dream, and we're trying to navigate this dark past. And here's another formulation when it comes to unlocking modern literature. This comes from James Joyce, or indeed Stephen Dedalus, in Ulysses. History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake. We see this as very much the defining sentiment, whether in elitist literature or popular literature, when it comes to the 20th century. And in our lecture series, we'll talk about the concept of dreaming true, which is a concept that Daphne du Maurier inherited from her hypnotist and famous author grandfather, the idea that by returning to your memories, returning to the past, you can navigate through them, you can navigate through this dreamlike fiction and discover something eternal and true. And it really does feel like we're entering the maze of our unconscious when the book opens. So when you read Rebecca, you're actually being induced into a hypnotic daze in which you plunge to the depths of your unconscious and learn something profound. You confront the monsters of your mind. And I think this is why we like horror films so much and why they're so addictive. We love being scared in a controlled environment because we feel like we can emerge stronger. Whatever doesn't kill us only makes us stronger, as Nietzsche would say. We get this small dose of poison to develop some immunity to it. And of course, the most terrifying thing of all is our mind. And so the Gothic as a perverted quest romance is going to be about plunging to the very depths of hell, down into the inferno, to rise again. But who will we be when we come out the other side? We need to read and find out. One of the most terrifying aspects of Rebecca is the fact that along the way she is pulled into assuming or attempting to assume the role of a dead woman. And thus she becomes, for a time, one of the living dead, we might say. She enters a winter time world, a world of the winter season. And it is not for nothing that her new name, the name of this man, the name that had been another woman's name before hers, is De Winter. Daphne was actually inspired by the villain of the Three Musketeers, which we read together at the book club, Menabilly de Winter. She was inspired to name her male protagonist Maxim de Winter. And if you think about that, what's a maxim? It's a profound philosophical saying. We talk about the maxims of Marcus Aurelius. So he is a maxim of winter, and so we, with the heroine, is entering a wintertime world, and Daphne du Maurier very much split her own persona right down the middle, and she put much of herself into the dead Rebecca and much of herself into the narrator too. The existential conflict and the conflict of identity that she felt in her real life plays out in these protagonists in Rebecca. And at the end of the day, I think that's why this has had such enduring popularity and resonated with so many people, men and women alike. Yes, it has great narrative verve. Yes, it's gripping and really powerfully written. The prose is beautiful. It sounds like the kind of melodramatic, poetic prose that a young girl might write after reading Wuthering Heights, and that's by design. It's supposed to sound like that. But at the end of the day, it speaks to an identity crisis, a split right down us that we can all relate to. And perhaps we can all relate to her feeling possessed. Our narrator is possessed by jealousy. Now, if you look at the etymology of the word possess, you see it means to occupy, to hold, and to have ownership of. But it also comes to us in the sense of being possessed demonically, like the devil possesses us, or a force, an otherworldly, supernatural, ghostly force possesses us. We become the possession of something or someone else. Isn't that interesting? And so not only do we have the feminist anxiety of being possessed by a man, but we also have the perennially human anxiety of being possessed by the past. We are all subject to tortured nights where we lay awake now and then, where we replay the errors of the past, and often we run through things that didn't happen and won't happen. Our imagination is the most terrifying thing of all. But jealousy and love is a form of possession in which you are not yourself, which begs the question, who are you? Or who is the self you think you are? Our narrator is possessed by a past she does not fully understand. And we might also look to the etymology of the word haunt, which means to frequent or dwell in a locale, to inhabit. So hauntings are intricately tied to specific locations, and at the very roots of the word haunt, you've got the idea of going home or returning home or searching for a home. And we have that searching for home in this book. We have that searching for the truth of the past, and we have that searching for the self. By examining what possesses you, you are ultimately exploring who you are. And so Daphne du Maurier channeled her own feelings of possessive jealousy, her own anxiety about the past, and in so doing gave us a reading experience that is incredibly therapeutic. Rebecca would be the last super best-selling novel right before the onset of the Second World War. It sold millions of copies worldwide on both sides of the Atlantic. It became a roaring success in the UK and the USA alike, and since publication it's never gone out of print. What's really interesting is, as she was writing the book, she told her publisher, Victor Galanx, that it was a sinister tale about a woman who marries a widower, and it was psychological and rather macabre, but she emphasised that the second wife is haunted, but it's not a ghost story. So Daphne du Maurier is redefining what a ghost story means, and she also shows us in this book what traditional ghost stories have ultimately always been about. They've been about us and our minds. Again, we might turn to Shakespeare's Macbeth and we can see that starkly. Ghosts come about when a real tragic and terrifying past clings to and remains in the present. Ghosts are typically figurations of our own mental life. We people the void with phantoms, as Guy de Maupassant would say. Daphne du Maurier would say to her publisher that Rebecca is a study in jealousy, and it's more about hate than love. And this is true. What's really exciting about Rebecca is it goes through really distinct generic gear shifts. You've got romance, you've got mystery, you've got horror, you've got all of this represented, and when you read the book you feel like you're on shaky and unstable ground, just like the narrator. Despite saying this, however, the publishers ran a huge advertising campaign selling the novel to booksellers and the public as a romance. Now, we spoke about romance as quest narrative, and the Gothic is a development of that, and in that sense, yes, it is a romance, but that's not the romance the publishers meant, nor the one we think of in the 20th century when we use that word. And it doesn't mean romanticism either, though there is much of the dreamy and descriptive poetic power of the Romanticism movement in this work too. But no, in the 20th century, when someone says romance, they mean love story, which, without going into it too much, is not only a reduction, but a bit of a rug pull as well. And yet the reading public absolutely devoured it and read it up. The critics, however, not so much. And Daphne du Maurier would forever be labelled as just a romance writer, or a mere writer of women's stories. The thing is, the 1930s, the decade in which du Maurier was publishing, was when Mills and Boon really moved towards marketing escapist fiction with stories focused on romantic relationships in the UK, and so the connotations of the word romance began to shift, and people would think increasingly of these rather risque and swiftly digestible, fast stories. Now, I love great literature, but I think even the fast stuff, even the popular stuff and the pulpy stuff should not be dismissed. You don't want to eat Michelin every day of your life. Sometimes you want something fast and digestible, and escapism is a real gift, and we should cherish it. But still, this designation irked Daphne du Maurier no end. Not because she scorned such works, but because she wasn't writing Mills and Boon romances. And when you say someone's a romance writer, that's what people think. Sure, she has some romance works, and many of her works contain elements of love, and that's fair to say. But as she herself would say, if you actually read my stories, many of them are quite ghastly. I'm not a romance writer. And I suppose it hurt her a great deal because the critical reception was quite bitter and fierce. Now, as we said, readers, the ones who mattered, loved her works, but the critical reception was incredibly snobbish. But of course that's still going to hurt. When you divest so much of your deepest secret self into a work and then have the literary pretensia cut it to shreds, that's painful. She got criticised for being too melodramatic and for having too obvious popular appeal, whatever that means. But the fact is, this is a 20th century phenomenon too. It used to be for the longest time that which was popular was often great art too. Shakespeare was popular entertainment. Dickens was popular entertainment. The Brontes and George Eliot, popular entertainment. And then we see a huge gulf separates in the 20th century, where you can either be a popular bestseller or you can write the real stuff. And we start to see this divide. And it could probably be argued that many critics are artistically blocked and repressed artists, and so much of this comes from jealousy. It's like saying, hey, okay, you can be popular, but you can't be highly rated at the same time. And yet I think this is great literature. And I find myself, like many readers, returning to Rebecca every few years. Every time there's a power cut and I have to use candles to light the place, I pick up Rebecca again and I fall in love with the work all over again. I'm haunted by it and possessed by it all over again. And we're going to be reading it together, and we're going to be getting inside it and inside our own minds, and we're going to be having a really fun and haunting autumnal season at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. So do join us. Join us for the read through, and we're going to discover exactly what it is that made this book so incredibly popular. You can read Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca at patreon.com/hardcore literature, and you will find the greatest group of the most sensitive readers and lovers of literature that you can find anywhere in the world. And we also have a very extensive back catalogue. We're coming in close to about 700 different lectures and read-throughs and talks and discussions of the great books with so many of our favourite writers. So there's always something for everybody to explore, and I put an enormous amount of work and focus into ensuring that whatever work you pick up for the first time for your book club read, I make sure every single work is an entrance into the rest of the schedule. And the entire year is filled with reads that complement each other, and everything we read also complements the back catalogue, but you can start wherever you want, and I hope for many that Rebecca is a good starting place. And I also know that we're going to have many rereaders, people who have reread this book quite endlessly and are keen to do it all again. We're going to have a really incredible discussion, and for your reading assignment, please check out the post for this discussion at patreon.com/hardcore literature. You will also find a resource section which is filled with recommendations for films and documentaries and books and rabbit holes to go down. And you'll also find some questions with each lecture to help stimulate your journaling, your marginalia, your thoughts on these books, and the most riveting discussion you will find anywhere. The threads underneath each lecture and each read make for absolutely phenomenal and insightful reading, and I'm really grateful for everybody who's making the club such a special literary oasis. And we've got a lot of exciting things on the horizon. A little later this year I will be revealing the book club schedule for 2026. We've got some great books to see out the rest of the year. We're going to be reading Jekyll and Hyde, we're going to be reading Jane Austen and Charles Dickens, we've read Faulkner this year, we've read Chaucer and Flaubert and Ovid and Homer and so many more. And I want to leave it there for today and say a huge thank you for watching, and also let me know your experience with Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. Are you gearing up for your first read? If so, what are you expecting and what would you like to get out of it? Or indeed, if this is a reread for you, what would you like to get out of it this time around? And what advice would you give to first-time readers to facilitate a meaningful experience? Thank you again for watching. I appreciate you, and happy reading. Bye-bye for now.